afternoon. My name is Paula Boland, and I am the president of the UN Association of the National Capital Area and chair of the UNA-USA National Council. Many thanks for joining today's program, which will focus on the role of women in UN Peacekeeping and Peacebuilding, sponsored by our Peace and Security Committee. UNA-NCA is among the largest and most active chapters in UNA-USA, serving over 1,000 members and engaging hundreds of volunteers dedicated to raising awareness about the vital work of the UN, its agencies, and the critical partnership with the United States. I would be remiss if I do not invite you to join our movement if you're not yet a member and get involved in our many committees and activities. As we celebrate the 64th anniversary of women's participation in UN peacekeeping operations, much progress has been made to promote the full, effective, and meaningful participation of women at all levels in peacekeeping and peacebuilding. Over the past 3 decades, the share of women peacekeepers has risen from 1 to 5% of all military contingents and 11% of all uniformed police units. Women are promoted to executive roles that shape the future of peacekeeping and peacebuilding, from Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations to Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. However, more outreach is needed to educate the public and elected officials about the vital impact of women in peacekeeping and peacebuilding. Today's event will examine the key contributions of women in UN military peacekeeping efforts and continuing challenges. It is now my pleasure to introduce our longtime member and volunteer leader, Patrick Realiza, who serves as co-chair of our Peace and Security Committee, along with Richard Ponzio, and works for the DC Mayor's Office. Thank you very much to our esteemed speakers and partners for making today's event possible. Patrick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, for the very kind introduction and opening remarks. Good afternoon to those tuning in from Washington, D.C. Good evening to those joining us from Europe and Africa. And lastly, good morning to those who may be joining us from the West Coast here in the United States. My name is Patrick Realiza, and I serve as the co-chair of the Peace and Security Committee for the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, or UNA-NCA. The UNA-NCA Peace and Security Committee is dedicated to promoting the core principles of the UN conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and peacebuilding efforts. Through a series of innovative programs and events, the committee's membership is aimed at elevating the awareness of past, present, and future initiatives while working to develop relevant policy recommendations to further strengthen the United States' key role in supporting UN collective security efforts, including multi-dimensional peace operations at the country level. On behalf of the UNA-NCA Peace and Security Committee, I would like to once warmly welcome all of you watching online. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly run through a number of key housekeeping matters. This session is being recorded on Zoom, and all general attendees are currently being muted. As a reminder, as this is being recorded, this includes the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Furthermore, we ask that you identify yourself and affiliation upon submitting your questions. We will do our very best to answer as many of them following the formal discussion portion of the program. In addition, please be sure to change your view from speaker to gallery if you wish to see the entire panel at one time during the program. There should be a button in the upper right-hand side of your screen in Zoom that will allow for this. Please go ahead and do so now if you wish. As noted by Paula, today's distinguished set of speakers will further examine the key contributions of women in UN military peacekeeping efforts and continuing challenges. Let me first begin by briefly introducing our 3 distinguished speakers for today, starting with Ms. Megan Corrado from the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Megan Corrado is an international lawyer and policy practitioner working to promote human rights, peacebuilding, gender mainstreaming, transitional justice, and post-conflict legal and governance reform. She has extensive experience in international development, grant implementation, advocacy, and political campaign management. Megan has worked on democracy and peacebuilding programs and processes in conflict-affected and post-conflict states across the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Eastern Europe. Before joining the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Megan previously served as a Director of Advocacy with Women for Afghan Women. Megan currently serves as the co-chair of the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, as well as Vice President for Global Affairs with the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues. Secondly, we have Ms. Allison Giffen, who is the Director of Peacekeeping at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC. Prior to joining CIVIC, Allison served as a Senior Advisor for UN Peacekeeping with the U.S. State Department's International Organizations Affairs Bureau, where she contributed to the drafting of the 2015 Presidential Policy Memorandum on U.S. support to UN peace operations and facilitated its implementation across the U.S. government. From 2009 to 2015, Allison was a Senior Associate at the Stimson Center, where she co-directed the Future of Peace Operations program and founded the Protecting Civilians in Conflict project. While at Stimson, she traveled often to undertake independent and UN Commission reviews of UN peace operations. Allison has also worked for Oxfam GB in Sudan, monitoring peacekeeping operations and coordinating non-governmental organization policy and advocacy initiatives. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Ms. Lonnie Keneally from UN Women in New York. Lonnie is a wing commander from the Royal Australian Air Force with over 20 years of experience. She is currently seconded to UN Women for 2 years that began in January of 2020 to work as a military liaison officer with a focus on peacekeeping. She has extensive policy development and practical experience in implementing diversity and inclusion measures, in particular with regard to increasing women's participation in the military, including a posting as a Director of Gender Programs for the Royal Australian Air Force. She has been a gender advisor to her Chief of Service, and prior to this posting, she was in charge of managing the Australian Department of Defence implementation responsibilities of Australia's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. As you can all tell from the very brief biographies that I just shared, we are indeed so fortunate to have a distinguished and accomplished set of speakers today. Please help me to virtually welcome all of them. Now let's officially begin the conversation with a startling statistic. In the year 2020, out of approximately 95,000 UN peacekeepers worldwide, women only represented about 5% military contingents and 11% of police units. My opening question this afternoon to the entire panel is, what would you say are the key structural barriers to women's participation in UN peacekeeping and peacebuilding efforts today? Megan, Allison, Lonnie, please feel free to chime in. I'm sure our audience members today are very much interested in hearing your take on this.
Patrick, would you like me to begin?
Sure, Allison.
Wonderful. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here in this event today. I've always appreciated the work that UNA-NCA does and had the privilege of speaking at one of your events probably 6 years ago. You know, there are a lot of structural problems that really prevent increased numbers of not only uniformed personnel in UN peacekeeping, but also civilian personnel in peacekeeping. And, you know, those can range from women are not given the equal opportunity to deploy to women do not have equal opportunities for career advancement. And then there are living conditions in the field that I can go into a bit more. But CIVIC really looks at peacekeeping in four peacekeeping contexts: Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, and South Sudan. And so a lot of my observations come from actually seeing what's happening in those peacekeeping operations on the ground, as well as we turn that research into advocacy to try and influence legislation at the UN, including Security Council resolutions and peacekeeping budgets. And I'm always really disillusioned when I'm sitting in meetings on women, peace, and security, and there are member states that have publicly pledged to support initiatives on women, peace, and security. And yet they will publicly say that actually, you know, a lot of the agendas and actions that need to be taken to advance women, peace, and security, you know, they contradict their culture, and so therefore aren't really going to support some of those initiatives. And even more disheartening to me at times, for example, are when some of these member states have, you know, signed on to these international voluntary commitments, et cetera, but then we see them in negotiations actually, you know, behind closed doors, successfully contradicting, advancing posts like gender advisors, women peace and security advisors that are deployed to peacekeeping missions, or even in some ways more egregious, cutting out references to conflict-related sexual violence and tools that peacekeeping operations can use to prevent conflict-related sexual violence, which is one part of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, right? And so this is always disheartening, but what really buoys me in all of this work is seeing the member states, the civil society, and the champions like, you know, that are involved in UN Women, Lonnie here today, that are inside the system, that are really fighting the fight to really try and address some of these structural and other types of barriers to increase women in peacekeeping. But I do think we have a long way to go, but it's been some of these initiatives like the ELSI initiative and others, which I can speak to more today, that have really created incentive systems and the ability to advance women in peacekeeping.
Thank you, Allison. And I think Megan, Lonnie, if you wanted to go next, I would appreciate hearing your take on this question.
Yes, thanks very much, Patrick. And I'll echo Allison's comments about thank you for the opportunity to speak here today on this panel with these esteemed panelists, must I say. I think one of the things that really sticks out for me when you ask this question is the lack of accountability in the system. So when we really get to the core of, you know, one of the big impacts for women's participation, we can look back very recently. There was a research done by the International Peace Institute undertaken by Dr. Lottie Vermeij, and it was called Woman First, Soldier Second, Stigmas and Taboos about women's participation on peacekeeping. And just really quickly, I'll just give a couple of quick stats. 96% of women experience discriminatory or sexualized behavior in UN peace operations. 94% experienced or witnessed or heard about sexual harassment, and 86% experienced or witnessed racism in UN peace operations. And before I go on, I'll stress this, the research was conducted across an incredibly diverse group of women, 142 in total from 53 countries. So this research is not just, you know, a little snapshot in time on a particular mission. This is, you know, across the board, and it's a very informative report. But what it didn't capture is the number of women that national militaries have lost because of these types of behaviours, which of course impacts their ability to serve on missions in the future, nor the number of women who have chosen not to come back and do a second mission, which we know is an issue because we do need to grow those senior leaders to come back as at the command level in the system. So I think from my perspective, that there are a lot of other things that were raised in that report, you know, things around the enabling environment, which I know there's some really good work going on in that space. But sometimes I think, whilst I think that's really important, you know, the old analogy of, you know, pick the lowest fruit. You know, it's kind of easy to build new facilities. Culture change is really, really difficult. We need to set consistent standards across the board in terms of what our expectations are of our leaders. And I'm not talking just the senior leaders, I'm talking leaders at every level in the organisation, both in the military troop-contributing countries, but also, you know, in those mission settings. And, you know, really, you know, show some really visible accountability for those types of behaviours. I think I won't talk too long here, but I think one of the other things is also about setting the conditions for women to network. Again, Lottie's report really brought out the fact that women are still having to work together in their own kind of little networks or create their own networks to overcome systemic barriers because there isn't a policy in place. You know, so working out ways to, you know, deploy and manage childcare, all sorts, the whole kind of gamut of things that you can imagine that come to light when we talk about deploying women from certain cultures where they have caring responsibilities and stuff. So lots of those sort of things came up as well. So the idea around networking is really, really important. I think the UN could put something in place, and I do believe there is an initiative underway to create a women's network. To allow women to, until we do have those systemic policy interventions happening at a more rapid level, to allow women to continue in that networking piece. And again, of course, the resourcing for making sure that women's equipment fits well, is it really okay that we still see women deployed wearing men's equipment, wearing men's kind of ballistic vests and things like that, so body armor and whatnot. So investing in the right equipment for women, and investing absolutely in the talent management of our women, so that we can grow them and get them back as senior leaders. So I can talk for ages about these types of barriers, but I'll hand it over to Megan in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Lonnie. Megan?
Yeah, thank you both. And I think what we can really sort of sum up both the comments from Allison and Lonnie are it's a patriarchal problem, both at the local country level that sort of trickles up to the peacekeeping operations. There's, whether it's overt or not, the things like not having access to adequate uniforms, or that fit women's, or the guns that fit them, or having barracks for women. So it's like these little things that exist very much at the country level are often replicated and amplified at the peacekeeping level. And I think, really the sexual harassment, exploitation, and abusing, it really is the major thing. Not only are women experiencing it personally, but it's a deterrent to want to go serve in these contexts because it's such a ubiquitous problem. And then I think another thing that arises is there's a sort of a tokenism that when you have a female peacekeeper in the field, they're expected to, be the one going out into the community and speaking with the women and girls that have been exploited or abused. And sometimes they don't have the necessary training to do so. Sometimes just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're an expert on all these things. So, making sure that they're equipped, and then not only to deal with those situations and those civilians, but then also to process that trauma. If you're constantly going out in the field and hearing these stories over and over again, that secondary trauma is real. It's something the entire peace building and peacekeeping field deals with. So it's something that we need to sort of pay attention to and make sure that we're equipping our female peacekeepers with the skills to succeed and to process and to cope and to share lessons learned that can be multiplied both with men and women, so that the women in the field are not carrying the double burden of both having to be a competent peacekeeper, but also, a counselor, a psychologist, doing all that social support as well. So it's really just thinking through all of the institutions and sort of micro patriarchal aggressions, I would say, that we see both at the national and international level.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Lonnie. This is a great way to kick off our conversation. So I'll just dive right into these questions. And as a reminder for the audience members, please keep your questions and we will get to them after the formal panel discussion. So I'd like to start off with you, Megan. You currently serve as the co-chair of the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, or commonly WPS. For those who may not be familiar with the WPS agenda, could you please explain to us what UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is and how has it been implemented over the past 2 decades?
Sure, thank you so much. And I see some names in the participant list who have long been involved in the creation and advocacy for and just implementation. I see Karen Mulhauser there, one of my favorite humans in the world. So good to see some folks who have been in this fight for a long time. So 1325 was passed in 2000 after years of advocacy, and basically was trying to get the UN and member states to recognize that you can't build sustainable peace when you exclude half of the population. You can't have a functional military when you're excluding the perspectives of half the population. So it really came down to a number of different pillars. So 4 pillars. One is calling for the participation of women at the peace table, in peacekeeping operations, as soldiers, as police, as civilian advisors, making sure that they are involved in all aspects of prevention, mitigation, and conflict resolution, in order to recognize the unique role that women play in conflict and fragile states. They're not just necessarily, they can be combatants, they can be sexual abuse survivors, they can be the widows of soldiers that need to take care of their family, they can be spies. There's really, women are not a monolith. And so this attempts to try to recognize all the different roles in which women play and make sure that those perspectives are incorporated to efforts to end conflict and promote peace. So the second pillar is protection, and that really aims to both protect women and girls from gender and sexual-based violence in conflict settings, to make sure that we have protective mechanisms in place to deal with emergency humanitarian situations, and to make sure there's a protective environment for post-conflict and crisis recovery. And then the third one is prevention. Really looks to make sure that we're putting together smart intervention strategies on the prevention of violence and conflict, both generally and against women. It calls for accountability mechanisms we put in place that comport with international standards, international humanitarian human rights law, and really works to sort of support and protect local women's peace initiatives so that they can have the seat at the table, that their voices can be amplified so that they have the opportunity to participate in peacekeeping operations. And then the last one is relief and recovery. It recognizes the ways in which women can play a role, need to play a role, because again, you can't address this huge societal problems if you're omitting the perspectives of half the population. It calls for advancement of relief and recovery measures to incorporate women's perspectives and their particular needs, say in refugee camps, IDP camps. So really just trying to take a holistic look at the way in which women can promote peace, promote stability, and conflict. And I guess just quickly, I would say, how is it being implemented? A number of different member states, I think we're up to 92 now, about half of UN member states have implemented national action plans, which try to actualize these 4 pillars in their policy, both at the domestic level and how they organize their development, defense, and diplomatic agencies, but also in the ways in which they engage on the international stage. In the United States, for instance, we have the Women Peace. We had a NAP that was evolved over time since 2011. We passed the Women, Peace and Security Act in 2017. A strategy was released in 2019, and then implementation plans for those key agencies came out in 2020. So now we're trying to figure out, how do we implement this? You know, there are certain test cases like in Afghanistan that we can talk about in more detail later. And just the question I would say is, why is it important? You know, we talked about, again, can't have peace if half the folks aren't there. We know that peace processes are more likely to be durable and sustainable if women are involved. But I think 35% more likely to survive over 15 years if women are at the table in a meaningful way, not just in a tokenistic way. You can't just have one woman, you know, again, women are not a monolith. They have a lot of different perspectives. And we also know that women participants bring, you know, perspectives that are not necessarily focused on the spoils of war. They're focused on economic development. They're focused on education. They're focused on transitional justice and truth-telling processes that are necessary to move the country forward. So I would just say, you know, again, not to bang the drum here, but you can't create and keep sustainable peace when it only involves half of the population, because it's not just bad math, it's bad policy.
Thank you, Megan. I like that last part, not just bad math, but bad policy. So, but overall, your, clarification on how UN Security Resolution 1325 is helping to implement that. And these past 2 decades is very powerful. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what can be done moving forward, right? And so just moving right along through my questions here, Megan, I have another one for you on troop and police contributing countries, or TPCs. They're expected to implement the WPS agenda and facilitate the participation of women in UN peacekeeping missions. In your opinion, Megan, out of all the major troop and police contributing countries, or TPCs, which countries have been particularly successful at promoting women's participation, and what factors do you believe have contributed to their successes?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean when you're talking about success. I mean, are we talking about overall numbers? You know, you have a number of countries from the global south, Bangladesh, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Nepal, who have really large contingents of women serving in peacekeeping operations and police units. If you're talking about percentages, you have countries like Albania, who has 100% female representation, but they have two members serving from their delegation. So, you know, talking about the Philippines, they're 64%. It's at, 7 out of 11. So I think you need to, kind of, what are we thinking about what makes success? Are we talking about financial contributions? And you have, some of the global north countries that are providing a lot of the support, that has the equipment and training and things like that is important for success of peacekeeping, missions more broadly. And I would say, I think, the other panelists can speak a little bit more to what success looks like in reality, in practical reality and measured in the field. But I would say, Canada has been quite the leader as alluded to earlier, the ELSI initiative. They're the largest contributor to the ELSI Trust Fund, which is really trying to get to the root causes of the structural barriers that women face participating in peacekeeping operations. So I think their leadership, both in research and funding and drawing attention to this issue, which we're not going to overcome these sort of dire figures of the numbers of women in peacekeeping police units until we sort of address the root causes that we've been talking about from the outset.
Thanks, Megan. I think it was great for you to kind of elaborate the different factors, because success can be measured in many different ways and percentages and numbers, but how do we come to that benchmark that we can use moving forward, I think is something to keep in mind. And so I guess my last question for you in this kind of initial round of questions is, what would you say is the greatest impact the WPS agenda has had on men and women since the passage of 1325?
How much time do you have? No, I think it's a really good question. I think here we are 20 years out, there's still quite a way to go. But I see hope, I see progress. Again, the number of countries with the NAPs is increasing every day. We are seeing an uptick in, we are seeing more women, deploying into peacekeeping operations. We're now recognizing the value of gender advisors, both in peacekeeping situations and domestically. And that's so valuable and they can be men and women, but they just need to be experts. That's the key, having the training, having the education, the knowledge to be effective and do gender analysis and ensure we're, getting together data of that's gender relevant, sex disaggregated, age, all these sort of intersectional identities. Like that's something so important for us to measure our success and failures moving forward in implementing the WPS agenda. I think one thing that's been really helpful over the last 20 years is sort of the slow cultural shift, the way in which we're talking about the role of women and the role of men in peace and security situations. I think there's a lot more really good programming going into work and thinking about how we speak to men about women's role in peace processes and peacekeeping and security forces. There's a whole movement behind peaceful masculinities. And so going into local contexts, speaking in the cultural sort of vernacular and explaining why it's good for you, good for your society, good for your culture, good for your country, good for your region, good for your world, to have women play a substantive role in decision-making throughout all facets of society.
Thank you, Megan. And if we have more time, we will circle back on this question and let you elaborate further, but I do appreciate you kind of giving your take on that. So now we're going to switch gears and go over to Allison, and I have a few questions for you. So my first question is, in 2017, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres launched a system-wide strategy on gender parity, which basically sets targets for equal representation of women and men. The strategy has yielded some positive results. For instance, the share of women in UN peacekeeping operations senior leadership posts have risen from about 21% in 2017 to approximately 41% in the year 2020. In your opinion, Allison, and based on your expertise, what do you believe has made the gender parity strategy so successful, and what can be done moving forward?
Thanks so much, Patrick. I think somebody like Lonnie, who's actually inside the system, can probably speak more, because it's very difficult from the outside to really understand what is and is not working inside a bureaucracy, right? But from the perspective of just reading the strategy and seeing what I've seen on the ground, there's three issues that I'd like to highlight. One is the issue of pipeline. And so, it's about making sure that women are aware of applying for, being nominated for positions, and that they have the training and skills needed to succeed in those positions. And this is supported by practices such as rosters of interested and qualified women. So not just rosters that the UN keeps, but I remember when I was serving in the US government, for example, the State Department was trying to keep a list of women who might be good to nominate or to encourage to apply for certain posts in the UN. And even as a member of the State Department, I would sometimes get those types of positions pushed to me by the State Department to try and either apply for or to push out to others to apply for. Then there's the issue of selection. And this is where the UN has control over selection, like in the case of senior mission leaders, particularly in the civilian, they're of course going to be able to get to better statistics if they have control over that. So the UN has more ability to address the issues when it comes to women in those senior leadership posts, as well as individual police and individual military officers if they're getting the candidates nominated and applying for those posts. However, it becomes much more tricky in the case of formed military units or formed police units. And this gets at the issues of, when you have infantry battalions, when you have helicopter units, when you have those more operational roles, a lot of countries don't have women serving in those positions generally. And so it's much more of you have to go way upstream to get to those issues where you can get more women who are available in those roles. Now, this is different from female engagement teams or mixed gender teams, which are easier, for example, for the UN to select for deployment. And I want to raise one issue that's really important here when we talked about measuring success and percentages. One of the big barriers is making sure that there are women in frontline posts in these when they're serving in peacekeeping missions. So you see a lot of women in administrative and support roles like cleaners, et cetera, in some of these units. And what we really want is women, not just in the leadership roles, but in those really key roles, especially when it comes to engaging communities, like community language assistance, community liaison assistance, which are more civilian posts or national posts. And that's important. And then the third thing is this enabling environment, which Lonnie and Megan were alluding to or speaking directly to. There's the physical environment. So I've been out to some of these temporary operating bases and field offices. And, they have sometimes, tents in which a whole bunch of men are sleeping, military men, and they have bathrooms that sometimes are quite scary that both women and men are using. In some of these places where there's not civilian offices at all for the UN, there's actually no accommodations for women to travel out to these locations. So that's real. There's the sexual harassment and discrimination issue that was mentioned. And then, of course, if you don't have the ongoing mentorship networks and training, it's not just about women succeeding in their posts in the moment, but wanting to and being able to redeploy. So I would say that those are some of the things that the gender parity strategy, it acknowledges those issues, and then it sets out some ways to try and address those structural issues. And that's where I've seen that it's comprehensive in some ways.
Thanks, Allison. That picture you painted of the bathrooms wouldn't even cross my mind. I think that that they would be using facilities, and right now we are in a pandemic, and so personally I just try to avoid public restrooms in general, even if we're not in a pandemic. But that's unacceptable, and something I think personally could be simply done to fix that. But thank you so much, Allison. Continuing on this conversation of like gender and so forth, I wanted to ask a question in regards to gender quotas in peace operations, and we all know that's a complicated issue. So if you don't mind elaborating for us the strengths and limitations to having gender quotas, I mean, how effective of a strategy is that? In your opinion, you'd say in promoting women's participation, what are the alternative strategies that you might recommend if you were at the table?
Yeah, again, I'd be really interested in the other panelists' perspective on it. But for me, given the types of obstacles I can see, I don't think we will see change without quotas in some ways, or at least benchmarks in some ways. There's too many obstacles, and we need to be pushing everyone in the system to be meeting certain benchmarks. And again, that issue of accountability. So if you're not meeting the quotas, how else are you going to measure whether the system is, well, there are other ways, but it's one way to measure if the system is moving. However, quotas on their own don't work, as we were saying, and that's what you were saying about the alternatives. And so that's why it's really important to have those pipelines and the enabling environment, et cetera. And this issue of incentive and the ELSI initiative, which both Megan and I raised, I think is really key. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about what the ELSI initiative does, which is member states actually came together in 2017, and I was really privileged to be at the launch of the initiative in Vancouver. They've actually created a multi-donor trust fund, and that trust fund gives funding to troop and police contributing countries. It gives them access to financial assistance to support evidence-based activities and the deployment of trained and qualified uniformed personnel over the short and long term. So for example, funding for training and mentorship programs for commanders and senior personnel, for example. And the other thing is it creates premiums for gender strong units. So, you know, it could be formed police units with a number of women in there. And so, you know, these initiatives, they take time to work well, but the fact that there is a financial incentive and also funding for countries that may not have the kind of financial flexibility to really invest in this, I think is really important when you're talking about quotas or just simply trying to raise the number and the percentages.
Thank you, Allison. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Lonnie. I have a few questions, but I wanted to give you a few moments, Lonnie, if you wanted to react or respond to some of the previous comments in regards to the gender quotas and so forth that I had asked Allison, since you are an expert and so forth on when it comes to being a gender advisor. So I opened that up to you before I had my other questions here.
Thanks, Patrick. I think Allison is quite right. I think quotas are a very powerful tool, but they can't work in isolation. And I thank you both for raising the LC Initiative Fund, because it is a really terrific kind of initiative by the Government of Canada, and now it has a number of other donors that are contributing to the fund. But it is kind of really a transformative program where we can now get into some of these countries that have, you know, to date been struggling to get women into their national militaries. Because let's be honest, if we can't address the root causes in those national militaries about why women are not participating, we cannot increase women's participation in peacekeeping. That's a fact. So I think we're now starting to look at the ways of supporting national militaries to kind of get after some of those barriers. And the LC initiative is a great way to look at that. And I think as that program of work continues to evolve, we'll see some really good lessons come out of that. That will be applicable across the board. So I am definitely in favour of quotas. I think one of the things that I will stress about that, and has come out in research and just indeed from talking to other women, military women and peacekeepers, is that when we are putting women or are using quotas, we do need to make sure that we're not just adding women, that we are actually allowing them to do the role that they've been trained to do. So if they're deployed into the missions to do a certain role, despite what the commander or what somebody else thinks, because they're a woman, they should not be marginalised and, you know, left behind the wire, or, you know, kind of shimmied off into an administration job, when in actual fact they should be working as part of that kind of forward-looking team, or out, you know, patrolling or whatever it might be. And by the same token, we shouldn't be essentializing the women either. And I think Megan made a very good point about that, in terms of, you know, just because you're a woman does not make you necessarily the right woman to go and speak into the community, or deal with conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence issues or anything like that. And I do have a question about gender advising later, so I won't get into that at the moment, but also absolutely agree with Megan's comments about, you know, we're starting to see an improvement about the use of gender advisors and protection advisors and things like that in the missions. Absolutely should be both men and women, and the critical piece in that is that they are trained, and they are trained both in how to, you know, identify, acknowledge, and most importantly, report, so that, you know, planning and mission planning and interventions can then be responsive as opposed to slow. Okay, so yeah, that probably follows up on those. Thanks.
Thank you, Lonnie. So it seems like there's this kind of dichotomy between the military structure and having workforce diversity. And so I would love to hear your take, if you could share some real life experiences, if you feel comfortable, and to kind of better illustrate this tension between those two. And, you know, especially for, I know that we have some young women in the room who are possibly interested in pursuing a similar career path or something along the lines of UN peacekeeping, peacebuilding. I'm sure they would love to hear, as well as I, your real life experiences, if you don't mind sharing, Lonnie.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Look, what I will say is, before I share, I do have a bit of an anecdote to share here today. a basic military structure is inherently in opposition to a diverse workforce. Okay, so a military by its very nature is uniformed. And I don't just mean by what we wear, I mean by everything that we do. And it is drilled into, when you go to an initial military training academy or officer training academy, we create this kind of concept of wanting to, recruit from the entire population and recruit from a really diverse workforce, when in actual fact, which is fantastic, but in actual fact, when we bring them into our organizations, we do the kind of forming, norming, storming, performing type activity where we bring them all in, and I like to call it the cookie cutter effect, right? You've got all these lovely ingredients to make these fabulous cookies, and you bring them in and then you mash them all together, and then the only cookie you get is one cookie and it's all the same. So that's kind of my analogy when I talk about that kind of initial military training experience. We tend to knock the diversity out of people for a period of time at least. And that's just that expectation that it's team before individual, and so we don't tend to in many cases foster that kind of individuality or that diversity. And I think one of the big risks that we have with that is that within our institutions, or within these military institutions globally, often the people that we expose initial trainees to are in fact people that have been indoctrinated into the military for 20 years, and usually they will have some very kind of firm views about, they absolutely do. I can put it out there and say, in my experience, many of them have some very negative views about any kind of cultural change programs, and it takes them a long time to kind of get on board with it. So if you can imagine that you have these kind of, people coming in and that's their first exposure, kind of reinforcing this kind of idea of the structure that you've joined, and, things like valuing physical attributes and ability to, be the fastest runner over being able to kind of be think outside the box, or your academic achievements and things like that. So I still see that there's that type of behaviors going on and kind of reinforcing that masculine type environment. And I think that kind of mindset of, that masculine mindset, that kind of idea of this ideal soldier, okay, that ideal soldier of being big, strong, pack on the back, and can drag his mates across the battlefield. That's a perception that we still deal with in Australia in some respects, and we see it play out in our regular community media. We see it come out every time we have put out, or most of the time when we have put out measures in the Australian context of positive discrimination efforts, like to quotas to increase women's participation or whatever it might be. There is a significant community backlash about that. So it's not just within the military. We have to look to the broader cultural piece, that kind of where we recruit our military from, and indeed the parents and the grandparents that we're recruiting our trainees from. In terms of, I can give a really good example. So how some of this can play out. A couple of years ago, the Australian Defence Force still has an ongoing relationship with the Australian Human Rights Commission. We did a review into why we hadn't managed to graduate any female fast jet pilots. Okay, very, very competent, excellent Western Air Force, but somehow we hadn't been able to crack that barrier of getting women through. So our chief at the time decided that he would get the Human Rights Commission to do a review, and it was a really interesting review. And I got to travel around with the Human Rights Commissioner as part of that review at times. And I recall when we were sitting down with a young female pilot who was going through her initial pilot training, and she talked about her experience in the cockpit, after her experience in the cockpit, which was doing a debrief with her instructor, and she failed one of her flights. And the feedback that she received from her instructor at that time was that she didn't have enough tiger. And then when she kind of explored the option of what that meant, the idea of what that enough tiger meant, it came out that he assessed her as not being aggressive enough when she flicked the switches in the cockpit. Okay, so as you can imagine, when we're doing this review, we go to we kind of go into the manual, we're talking to other instructors, and we're saying, where's this notion of tiger? Where does this come from? And that's just a bias and an assumption about, you know, how you need to perform, what you need to look like if you're going to be a successful fast jet pilot in the cockpit. So, you know, that's just one example. And, you know, I'm sure all my female colleagues in the military would have heaps as well. But I think that's a really good one that sort of showcases how that kind of subjective assessment just permeates through the system. Or can, you know, thankfully I can say that we've actually revised a whole pile of our system as a result of that report, and it's much better, and we've increased our success rate. But sometimes you need to kind of dig in and understand at the very core of it those kind of, you know, masculine kind of identities and patriarchal structures that the systems have been built on. All right, like the notion of merit, you know, it's a merit-based assessment based on what was decided a long time ago when it was only men serving in the military. And yes, it evolves, but it's still evolving in terms of what it actually looks like when the people at the very top are still all the same, or all, you know, kind of males, generally all males, and they have that their male view, their male perspective. And we know that likes like, right? So we know that if you can see yourself in somebody, well, then you're probably going to, you know, progress them. So we need to, or, you know, favor them potentially. So we need to do the interventions where we include, you know, women on promotion boards. We need to make sure that we have diverse experiences assessing our workforce and providing those opportunities for women. And I think, yeah, I think that probably is enough for that question. I'm happy to take more questions on that later, but I hope that answers what you were after, Patrick.
Yes, it does, Lonnie. And I think, you know, very powerful words and that anecdote that you shared. I hope that helps our audience members, especially those young women who are interested in pursuing a career along these lines. So I'm actually going to jump to my last two questions for the entire panel, just in the interest. I want to make sure that we do have as much time. We have a very dynamic audience with us today. So I have two final questions for the entire panel. The first one is, what are the key systematic reforms that need to be implemented by the UN to truly give women in peace operations the opportunity to thrive in a long-term career? And the second one is, because we are in the age of COVID-19 and the current pandemic, does the current pandemic provide an opportunity for peacekeeping and peace building? And if so, what opportunities would that be? And just as a disclosure, the second one was actually submitted to us by a friend of mine, Patricia Quadros, who is a local writer and blogger based here in Washington, D.C. We had a pre-event survey. I don't believe she's on the call. I haven't had a chance to look at the attendees, but that kind of very much stood out because, you know, everyone is still thinking about COVID, but I'd like to hear each of your take on COVID and peacekeeping and peace building. So again, those two questions. The first one is the systematic reforms to be implemented by the UN to give women in peace operations the opportunity to thrive in their careers. And then the pandemic itself, what opportunities can we benefit from and I guess use as an opportunity given the circumstances? So I will, and any three of you, whoever wants to go first, just go ahead.
I can jump in on the COVID question. I think, so my colleague, AFP's president and CEO, Liz Hume, has coined a really interesting term. She's calling COVID stabilization in reverse. We're seeing a lot of increased conflict. We're seeing democracy backsliding, civil unrest all over the world. I think the new estimate is that there's going to be 13 more conflicts by the end of 2022, which is a 56% increase since pre-COVID forecast. So I think there's going to be no shortage of opportunities for peacekeeping operations in the future. That said, I think it's important to address number one as soon as possible, because the world's only becoming more fragile. And I think even if we all get our vaccines and this pandemic disappears in the next year or so, which probably isn't happening anyway, but I think there's going to be reverberating effects of this for many, many years. And so now is the time to think strategically about, start doing some forecasting about what are the areas of the world that we're going to, there's opportunities for intervention in the peacekeeping context. but let's use this time really effectively to do those structural reforms. And I think it needs to come very much so from the country level. You need to be breaking down these sort of patriarchal systems that we've been talking about at the level, of the member states, make sure that they're getting more gender advisors. Whoever holds the purse strings, in the United States, it's Congress, make sure that they're giving funding to our security apparatus to hire those folks, to do training from the top to the bottom up. You got to be making sure the graybeards that have been around for 50 years understand WPS principles, and you need to be doing that at basic training on day one. And so I think let's also apply that within the UN context as well. Very much to what Leanna was talking about, the folks that these sort of attitudes are enshrined. So how do we systematically break down those ideas? But yeah, interested to hear more from them. Just wanted to start us off.
Thank you, Megan. Lonnie, go ahead.
I'll pick up on the first one, like the systemic reforms. I think absolutely off the bat, I would say that the concept of a zero policy on sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and sexual exploitation and abuse needs to be more than just a hashtag. I have the same issue with the bystander. I love the term bystander, but I think sometimes when we have these kind of little catchphrases or hashtags, it lacks a little bit of the what would you call it, like the strength behind it. So sometimes I toy with the idea of saying you're not a bystander, you're a witness. If you're there, you've seen it, so you've actually witnessed it. So I think first and foremost, we need to see, as part of some systemic reforms, is some really visible policy and some really visible actions around the lived experiences of women in peacekeeping and the behaviour of peacekeepers on the ground. So we've got two separate issues here. We've got the sexual exploitation and abuse piece, which we know is very well known, and certainly has, I think I counted in the C34 report yesterday, 40-something references to that. But the other piece that I know that the International Peace Institute are actually undertaking some research now about the experiences actually of women and being sexually assaulted, sexually harassed whilst they're on mission. And I think that's really going to be a really important piece of research to help drive that systemic reform around behaviours, because culture and standards of behaviour need to be consistent. Standards of training, we need to make sure that we've got really good training around gender, but also about racial bias and those types of things. From a military perspective, I think what I also think would be really good, or what we should be looking at in terms of systemic reforms, is within our operational plans. So when we talk about the mandates, we want to make sure that they actually include not just a tag-on piece about women, peace and security or about gender, but actually that the concept of a gender perspective is mainstreamed through those mandates. Because I know as a gender advisor, and being in a deployed environment as a gender advisor, if it's not in the operational plan, it doesn't get done. So it needs to be, included as part of the operational plan. It needs to have a reporting requirement on it. Okay, if it doesn't have a reporting requirement on it, it will be overlooked. People will not pick it up as a nice to have. It has to be mainstreamed through the system. I was going to make one other point there and it has just slipped out of my mind. I'll come back if it comes back to me, because it was going to be important. I think, oh no, yes I do, I have it now. It's data. The other thing is data. And I know in the Secretary General's UN Peace and Security report for 2020, a big reference was made. He made 5 forward-looking goals, and one of them was about creating this kind of global effort to improve the data collection on women, peace and security. And, I think it was Megan that raised it before about, making sure that data is disaggregated, but, we need to move beyond just, men, women, and age. We need to be looking at all sorts of cultural pieces and, everything that kind of makes those individuals, right? And that in itself, if we have that data and if we use that data correctly through our intelligence and planning process in our development of our mission plans and whatnot, that in itself should be driving how we create the teams for deployment. Okay, so if we know that we are working in an environment, say in Africa where there's, these groups on the ground, and we know that the demographics of this proportion of men, women, children, tribal pieces, that an intelligence analysis of that should be fed back in to the overall planning piece, and then the team that we decide to send out on the ground should reflect the need. Okay, so that we need to get a little bit more sophisticated. I'll go back to my first point about getting this stuff into the actual operational side of the operation, the women, peace and security piece. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Lonnie. Thank you, Megan. I want to just quickly comment. I think the data is very important, and then maybe good data. And so it would be interesting to kind of follow up. And if you have resources to share, please share them with me, and I'm happy to share them afterwards with my committee members and our attendees for today. But Allison, I wanted to let you chime in if you had some thoughts on those two questions.
Yeah, I'll just add on to what was already said and sort of bridge two pieces of them. So as Megan was saying, I mean, with COVID, the rate of conflict-related sexual violence hasn't slowed. In fact, there's some evidence that, in fact, other types of gender-based violence have actually increased. And what we've seen in the field is, for obvious reasons, peacekeeping operations haven't been able to deploy as much and get involved as much with communities on a lot of things like human rights investigation and other types of things, because of the do no harm principle, right? Like, peacekeepers themselves don't want to be contributing to the spread of COVID, right? And in addition, there have been some delays in rotation of troops. But I just want to say that, peacekeeping operations, we often focus on the uniformed components, but really it's the civilian components and the integrated mechanisms, which are civilian, military, police, that are actually really trying to carry out and able to carry out the main mandated objectives of a peacekeeping operation. And this is a really good time to be rethinking through how gender is mainstreamed. And we did a report looking at the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence through peacekeeping. And a lot of that looked at how peacekeeping operations approach gender and gender disaggregated data. And there is so much work to do on this front. And one of the recommendations, for example, is just the fact that peacekeeping operations aren't always doing gender sensitive, in fact, often aren't doing gender sensitive conflict analysis. Conflict analysis is a problem writ large in peacekeeping, but the way in which gender sensitive conflict analysis has come into being actually would just lend itself to improving conflict analysis overall for a peacekeeping operation, because you're looking at intersectionalities, you're looking at the way in which different individuals and communities in society are being affected by the conflict, and therefore you can craft a response better. And so this is really important, and yet peacekeeping operations are very behind, right? They're really just beginning to look at collect data on just how women and men are experiencing the conflict differently, let alone all of those other aspects. And so while COVID, yes, is always going to increase the demand, and they're constrained right now, it's also, I hope, a moment where, despite some of those operational restrictions on the ground, it does give us all an opportunity to really think through how some of the ways in which peacekeeping is approaching gender can change. That's, of course, an ideal, because a lot of the countries that we're working in, as Megan was saying, they're slated to last become vaccinated fully, right? Because they're the most disadvantaged with the least health infrastructure, et cetera, going forward. So this is going to be an ongoing challenge during COVID. And I'll cut it off there, but I think we should get into the data and transparency and accountability issue that Lonnie raised in the beginning around accountability when we get into some of the questions around sexual exploitation, abuse, and those things that were also raised in the Q&A already.
Thank you, Allison. Indeed, we do have a couple of questions, and Renee Doplick, who is the co-chair of our International Law Committee, has been sifting through them. Thanks, Renee. As a friendly reminder, all questions can be submitted through the chat feature if you haven't already done so. I know many of you submitted them through our pre-event survey, but if you could resubmit them for consideration for the panel, I'd really appreciate that. So I'm gonna ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And so we will go ahead and get started with the first question, which actually comes from one of my fellow Peace and Security members, Gordon Johnson. And his question is, how are women in UN military and women in the UN military and police peacekeepers received when they return to their home countries after completing their missions in conflict zones? So, I guess, how are they received, positive, negative? love to hear your take if you have some knowledge on that. Lonnie?
I can start with that one. Well, first of all, I'd say it's contextual to what country they're returning to and what they left when they went on their mission. Again, I'll draw your attention to the research I mentioned earlier, the Woman First, Soldier Second report. From what I can recall with regards to this issue was that women found it quite tricky, or reported that they found it quite tricky to actually, deploy, but found it, and within their own communities, they experienced, some backlash. And certainly there was another report that was done in Australia called Mothers in the Middle East. And that also indicated that women were really kind of, I guess, judged within their own community and in their own families about wanting to go and serve. Interestingly, in the Woman First, Soldier Second report, women found it easier to deploy the second time after they had deployed. And that's different from women who choose not to deploy the second time for other reasons, but those that wanted to deploy again found that the experience of choosing to deploy a second time was easier. And I think that was because they'd broken through that initial barrier of deploying, worked everything out within their community and their family, and they all managed to, go fine without them being there on the ground. So I think that that's a pretty, that's kind of where I can point, I guess, anyone who wants to look at that in any more detail with those two reports. But indeed, that's what that research found out. So I think it's very contextual, but yeah, that's all I can offer on that.
I don't know if Megan or Allison had anything else to add to that. If not, we can jump into some of the other questions. Let me go ahead and
just one thing quickly on that. I think it
Sure.
goes back to the earlier conversation we were talking about, barriers to women's participation in operations. There's sort of this protection sort of attitude towards women, and where they ended up, they deploy and they end up being held behind the line and not being able to do what they're actually trained to do. I think Lonnie mentioned that earlier. And it's those potential opportunities that have been sort of taken from them, that when they go home, I think, while the men can say, have this on their resume, I did X, Y, Z while I was in the peacekeeping operation, women may have been sort of robbed of that potential opportunity. So it's thinking about how we can make sure that women do have the opportunity to do everything men do as well, so that they have the career advancement they're seeking when they come back home.
Thank you, Megan. And so let me pull up my screen here with another question. The second one comes from Tom Bradley, who is our vice chair of programs at UNA-NCA. And he writes, given the high number of rapes, sexual assaults, and sexual harassment allegations involving UN peacekeepers as violators, are there tools available to the UN Security Council to punish or discourage habitual criminals and bad actors? The biggest hammer, he continues, the biggest hammer appears to be sending them home to face legal consequences. Those consequences almost never occur. Should the UN Security Council create more tools to provide more direct consequences? Are there other incentives? And have the numbers of incidents been reduced in the past 5 years?
I'm happy to jump in here. This is such an important issue, and I just want to highlight that it's not just the uniformed personnel, as I'm sure Tom Bradley's aware, that are committing these abuses. In fact, sometimes there's a higher rate of UN civilian personnel that are committing these types of abuses than the uniformed personnel. Now, when it comes to civilian personnel, the UN has a different way of through administrative protocols to try and deal with them. However, there's a really still a lot of work that needs to be done. I will say that this is sexual exploitation and abuse is just one piece of broader conduct and discipline problems and criminal behavior that really need to be addressed. And actually, SEA, there's been more work around trying to, create ways that people can report allegations on the ground, and then steps for transparency than in any other conduct and discipline type of an issue. And Security Council Resolution 2272 that was led by the US and issued a couple of years ago does create some form of transparency, and that troop and police contributing countries, when there's an allegation that has been brought against them, they then have to report on what has happened in the justice system to try and address that allegation. Of course, a lot of those cases may be dismissed. And I have to say, sometimes that's because of weak military or civilian justice systems in those countries or a lack of will. But also, I think we need to recognize that, you know, trying to get chain of evidence in some of these countries is really difficult. And that's something that needs to be improved. And that's something that the UN and member states have tried to improve. So for example, the UN now requires any company that has 300 or more personnel to send a national investigative officer to the ground. That unfortunately, they often have, you know, huge, they aren't necessarily trained to do so, but that are supposed to help get that chain of evidence. We've seen allegations against French officers, for example, and those haven't been taken forward in part because of the chain of evidence issue. And the US, in a US military justice system, might have trouble if it were trying to address an allegation for a similar chain of evidence. So that's not to excuse this at all. It's to say that the issue is complicated and that there's a lot of more work that needs to be done in order to ensure that there's justice and accountability and transparency when it comes to these issues.
Thank you, Allison. Megan, Lonnie, anything else to add to that?
No, I think that was a pretty good answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, moving right along here with the questions. Again, another one coming in from Sanri Olker, who is the UN representative of Journalists and Writers Foundation. What is the role of civil society organizations in helping member states realize the goals and implement 1325?
Sure, I can take that one. Being a co-chair of a civil society working group, I think it's important for folks to network and mobilize in coalitions, as well as, you know, using your own organizational platforms. You know, something we're trying to do in the United States is hold their feet to the fire to make sure that they are living up to their legal and policy obligations. So, you know, our group was very vocal in helping to craft the law. The WPS Act passed in 2017, obviously did a lot of consultation. So let me go back a minute. So we formed in 2010. So right around as the 2011 NAP was put out, there was lots of consultation at that point, pushed to make sure we were consulting as it was updated again in 2016, and then pushed to craft the law. Not everything we wanted was in the law, mainly authorization for funds, but it was a start, and it created the first ever, called for the creation of the first ever government-wide strategy. Now we have the strategy, we consulted around that, we provided recommendations both before and after when we saw gaps. Same thing with the implementation plans, you know, some were better than others, so there's 4 from DoD, state, USAID, and DHS. So we trying to help them implement it, even if we see gaps and we're not super happy with particular provisions of it, you know, trying to harness our expertise as a collective to make sure that they're moving forward in the most effective way that realizes the aim of 1325. And then I think, you know, what the community and civil society really needs to do is hold your governments to account when they're not living up to the policy and legal objective or requirements that they have. So for instance, in Afghanistan, many would argue, including myself, that this is the test case for the WPS commitments in the United States, and by walking away without any conditions, without any protections or plans to continue to empower our partners and the women and the gains that they've made over the last 20 years, I would say that was a failure of the test case. So it remains to be seen. There's still some time before full withdrawal, but yeah, so that's what civil society can do, make sure that they are not just saying this is what we're going to do, actually put the WPS principles in practice.
Great, thanks, Megan. And we have another great question here. Actually, it's an anonymous one. In addition to career opportunities, are there volunteer opportunities in peacekeeping and peace building, or I guess what a person may be trying to, you know, they may be aspiring to get involved into this field. And so again, we kind of touched on recommendations, but you know, how can they get involved, whether it's beginning as a volunteer or pursuing a career? And I guess each of you are more than welcome to share any relevant insight.
Well, I guess from my perspective, it would be to consider a career in the military. or police. Obviously, depending on what country you are from, I'm going to assume you're from the US. Not a huge footprint at the moment, I believe, in peacekeeping, but hopefully that will change. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, other panelists. But certainly an opportunity to deploy and indeed work as a gender advisor and grow your skill set. So that is one way you can do it. I'll leave it to my other colleagues regarding the volunteer opportunities. You might have more information on that.
Just from a UN perspective, there are UN volunteer positions. They take a long time to apply for, and often people are on the roster to become a UNV for quite some time. But I do really encourage people to do that, because in the field, UN volunteers, even though they aren't high up so that they can't really influence decision making at the decision making level, they are often doing really interesting positions, because peacekeeping operations have a lot of budget constraints. They use UN volunteers in very key posts. And so especially women who want to go in, or people who are really interested in gender in particular, I think I would encourage them to apply to try and bring those perspectives. The other thing is sometimes there are junior professional officer posts. So if you're earlier in your career or younger and you're a civilian, that's something to look out for, potentially to apply for as a way to get into the UN system. And then Megan, I don't know if you want to speak to other civil society, but of course there are a lot of organizations that work on UN peacekeeping from the outside, and tons of UN agencies, funds, and programs out there that are also really important to work for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, whether you're looking to work in WPS or peacebuilding more broadly, we're always in need of help. We're a very underfunded field. So we're always looking to really work with young people in particular to help train the next generation. So, you know, those of us that have been kind of learning as we've been going, it'd be super fabulous to have a whole cadre of young people with this expertise and knowledge, which is starting to happen. There's a DC student consortium that started at George Washington University. It now includes, I think, up to 19 or 20 universities in the DC area, but with plans to expand across the country and eventually globally. And they're doing amazing things. They work very closely with us. I'm happy to share their website in the chat. I will also drop the link to the CSWG as well. Check out our membership. They are constantly looking for volunteers, interns, fellows, young professionals. So happy to share that. And I would just say there's a lot of different work you can do on the civil society side. You can work on policy, you can work as an implementer, go do some, I mean, that's what I would absolutely encourage you to do. Go to the fields, get on the ground. And that experience is something you can sort of, one, it'll change your perspective. It'll give you, you know, a more global view of what peace building actually means, but then it, you know, can provide opportunities in terms of policy, if you want to go into government or the UN, or just stick to advocacy. So there's lots of different facets of the work. So I'll share some stuff in the chat.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Lonnie. Thank you, Allison. I think another lens that I was thinking of was, you know, obviously travel is still heavily restricted, and people still want to continue to pursue all the things they're doing, whether they're studying or going to school. So, you know, this is a great way to put in a call for UNA-NCA. I mean, we are, you know, an opportunity for you to learn and engage, and you kind of can do it here from DC or, you know, virtually, wherever really. And so, you know, as the head of as co-chair of Peace and Security, you know, we touch on many different topics. And I think this event has really opened my eyes. I mean, I can't, you know, express my gratitude enough for the three of you for the time that you put in to this program and just sharing your advice. And I think many of the people on my committee who are present here, and as well as our audience members, really can benefit from this. And so, you know, I would like to, you know, put that out there, that you can just get involved locally as, you know, as a local volunteer, as a committee member, and make those connections. And you never know, you know, when those connections will be pivotal and helpful for that next step. And so I think, you know, that's my kind of suggestion from my experiences with UNA-NCA. I've been a longtime member for the past 6 years. And, you know, before chairing this committee, I was also the head of sustainable development. So again, just, it's a great organization. And I think, you know, as much as people want to be going to conflict zones and so forth, that sometimes just isn't feasible right away because of the circumstances. And, you know, the entire world is still in this COVID-19 situation. So just put that out there. And I think I want to remind the audience that we only have a few more minutes left, and then I'll close it out with some remarks. So if you have questions, please do send them to us, and then we will do our best to answer them given the last few minutes or so. Okay, so I think there's also a question that, Megan, that you may be answering via the chat. It might be just helpful for our audience for me to read that out so that for everyone's benefit. So this comes from Nina Lahoud. Her question is, as it has been broadly acknowledged, the implementation of the WPS commitments set out in the 10 Security Council resolutions adopted over the past 20 years has progressed slowly. She has proposed in the above referenced article in the journal International Peacekeeping that the UN Secretary General should spearhead the formulation of a comprehensive action plan for the implementation to be led by an independent, eminent person reporting to him that would involve all stakeholders to set out specific timelines and a transparent accountability and reporting framework. What does, Megan, what do you think of this recommendation? And just for context, Nina Lahoud is a former official in the DPKO, Board of Directors of International Legal Assistance Consortium. So Megan, if you don't mind, I know you're typing your answer, but I think it'd be great for you to verbally share that also with the entire group.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to type, but so interested in the conversation, I got distracted and didn't finish my answer. But thank you for that question. I look forward to reading your article. This is the first I've heard about, first kind of proposal I've heard with this suggestion. I like the idea of, timelines and accountability. I really like the reporting idea. I do think, this sort of exposes the challenges of the UN system more broadly, that it's a voluntary group. I don't know that a lot of member states, that there would be a lot of domestic political will to support this. I don't know, I almost think you would have to have some kind of incentivizing mechanisms to make member states adhere to them. I think we could do something aspirational. That's very much what the UN could do. Set out a timeline, set out, some kind of reporting mechanism again, but it's going to have to be voluntary. I don't see, quickly thinking about this very interesting concept. So I'm really interested to read your article and think more deeply on this. But this is the kind of thinking we need. Progress has not been fast enough here at the UN level, at the across member states. So I really like bold thinking and new ideas to sort of move the ball forward. So thanks so much for already meditating on this, and I'd be happy to follow up with you and discuss this more deeply. Thanks.
Thank you, Megan. I don't know if Allison or Lonnie had anything to add to that, or so much. So we have a few more minutes of Q&A here, so we can see if a couple more questions come in. But as I said earlier, it's just been really a great experience to learn about the various aspects of women, peace, and security, and peace building and peacekeeping. And so, I definitely think that this won't be the last event for the Peace and Security Committee for UNA-NCA. And so I encourage all the members who haven't already asked a question, and we did have a couple of questions that were submitted in advance. And so that's why I was able to pull some of them. But, and Allison, did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to respond to one of the questions in the Q&A, if that's okay.
Sure, that's fine.
So Gordon Johnson was asking if it's still true that developed countries like the US and Europe are reluctant to provide any type of UN military peacekeepers. And I'd just like to say, in terms of the US is still only providing individual military staff officers. And in 2015, it actually pledged to double the number that it was providing, which was really still pretty modest. It was only 40 that they were trying to reach in the number of military staff officers. And so the US still has a policy that it won't really put sort of, units of uniformed underneath a UN flag. However, it is the largest trainer and equipper of other troop and police contributing countries. And I think with the new administration, this is a time when civil society can really be calling on the new administration to make new commitments to provide more individual military and police officers, and including women, and to better train them and prepare them for when they deploy, and also to be encouraging other ways that the US can engage through doing better protection of civilians and even gender training when it comes to the training and equipping that it does of others. And then I would also say that there are other ways that it can be involved, including sometimes it helps with what's called green on blue, which is they sort of send trainers into the field to help with those that are already deployed to provide really essential types of skills that the US does well. And then as far as Europe is concerned, we've actually seen an increase in the number of European pledges that have come in over the last few years. And that's really important because a lot of the developed militaries have more advanced types of equipment and assets and personnel that can be deployed when it comes to things like UASs, so unarmed surveillance and reconnaissance type of things, attack helicopters, those types of things that other countries may not be able to pledge. And those are essential for modern peacekeeping operations that are trying to be more mobile.
Thank you, Allison. And I think on that note, we will wrap up this Q&A portion, and I will close it out with a few remarks here on my end. So as noted earlier, UNA-NCA is a membership-based organization, and we'd like to encourage those who aren't yet members in the audience to please consider doing so. Membership affords you unique opportunities to attend events such as this one and much more. If you haven't already visited our website, please go to unanca.org. Again, I want to personally extend my gratitude to our 3 amazing panelists. We are so grateful for your time. I know even in the midst of this pandemic, everyone is juggling many commitments, personal, professional. And so to get the 3 of you on a Thursday afternoon during your lunch hour probably is very much appreciated. And I think based on the questions received and the comments in between, I think we had a very good conversation today, very well received. And also, I want to personally thank my Peace and Security Committee members who were so instrumental in making this possible. They really played, even though I serve as co-chair, they've really been instrumental in helping to put together this program, whether that's designing the graphic or the program brochure that you saw that went out in the reminder email. I really couldn't have done it without all of them. And then lastly, to our committee or our audience members from tuning in, I know that we had a couple of people from Europe and other places navigate this Zoom world that we are living in. And so I sincerely hope that everyone enjoyed today's program and that we will all see you again very soon. Thank you so much.